Hello, this is a TOK presentation by Timothy Kim. The topic of my presentation is affirmative action, and the real-world case scenario that I will be looking at is Fisher versus the University of Texas. This court case is essentially a conflict between the university and a student that applied to the undergraduate program named Abigail Fisher. This is a picture of Abigail. She applied in the year of 2008, and what she sought from the court was a overruling of a earlier decision in the case Grutter versus Bollinger. Grutter versus Bollinger was a 2003 case in which the Supreme Court ruled that race could play a limited role in the admissions policies of universities. Now, in the event that this case is overruled, it has severe implications for universities in America, and it will essentially make illegal any policy that depends on affirmative action. The crux of Abigail Fisher's case is that the Constitution and the 14th Amendment protects against discrimination on the basis of race, as it is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. This brings us to the question, is affirmative action a form of discrimination? Now, the definition of the terms involved in the question are very important, and it's important that we take a look at perhaps alternative versions and alternative definitions. Now, the definition of affirmative action is positive steps taken to increase the representation of women and minorities in areas of employment, education, and business from which they have been historically excluded. These steps involve preferential selection on the basis of race, gender, or ethnicity. Now, discrimination is also an important term that we need to look at. And the concept of discrimination relates to a guarantee that all persons shall be afforded equal and effective protection against discrimination on any grounds such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinions, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. However, besides the actual definition itself, the word discrimination carries a very, very negative connotation, and it's important to look at the term itself and how the connotation that it carries affects the way we perceive the question. So, discrimination in itself is not a negative word. To discriminate, the verb, is in itself not a negative action. We typically associate discrimination with prejudice, irrationality, when in reality it is a simple verb that means to compare things. For instance, let's consider a hypothetical scenario in which a city council is hiring new firemen. Now, let's say that there are two firemen before them, and one of them is a very fit individual, and the other is not a fit individual, and the unfit individual is unable to perform the duties of a fireman. Now, the city council will look at these two individuals and discriminate between the two and decide the fit individual is more appropriate, and thus they will only hire that individual. So in this instance, discrimination has occurred. We typically don't think of this as discrimination, but it is discrimination and it is readily acceptable. Now let's alter the hypothetical scenario slightly. Let's say rather than a fit individual and an unfit individual, we have a black individual and a white individual. Now let's say that the city council makes an arbitrary decision to hire the white fireman instead of the black fireman. once again, discrimination has occurred because they have compared the two and made a selection. So the question that we must ask is, what makes these two types of discrimination different? What makes one acceptable and the other not? And I believe the answer is we need to look at the intention behind the discrimination. And there are two standards by which we may measure discrimination or intention. The first is whether or not the discriminating party has a contempt for the target group and a desire to withhold from members the full benefits of societal membership. And two, whether discrimination has the effect of creating and maintaining social, political, and economic networks which concentrate power and authority in the hands of few, while relegating minorities to subordinate positions from which they cannot escape. That's according to the Stanford Encyclopedia. So, in the previous image, we talked about how intention plays a big role in determining whether or not something is immorally discriminatory, as discrimination that is immoral can exist. Another question that we should look at is race. What exactly is race? And there are two main schools of thought. And there are those who argue that race is a biological designation. Others say that it is simply a social construct. So the biological definition is essentially that on the basis of geographical origin and genetic distinctions, races do exist. This school of thought is actually becoming outdated as research emerges that states genetic differences between races are very, very minuscule and not significant. The social construct school of thought argues that it is essentially a agreement, a collective acceptance that there is a dominant group in society and there is a non-dominant group in society. And based on this conception of race, race indicates differences in status, and status indicates which race you are. And it either excludes or includes you from broader social constructs and disables or enables certain powers. So those are the two different perspectives on what race is. Is it a social construct or is it a biological distinction, a valid biological distinction? Now, this is another side of the question, and it's reverse discrimination. Certain individuals will claim that affirmative action is discrimination against, regardless of whether or not discrimination happened in the past, affirmative action is once again discriminating, and the basic line of thought is two rights don't make a wrong. And this is where moral absolutism can play a role. Essentially, the idea is that preferential treatment is not being given to blacks because they are black. They are being given preferential treatment because they have been mistreated. And let's look at an example to make that clearer, just in case that was a little vague. Suppose society passes a law that says no one shall take a television set from the possession of another. And then the next day your neighbor comes over to your house and takes your television. And then of course you call the police, and the police goes to your neighbor and says, we need the television back. And your neighbor refuses, so the police pull out their gun and forcefully take the television. Now, it wouldn't make sense for the neighbor to claim that, hey, the police were immoral because they forcefully took the television set from me, when there is a rule that says no one shall forcefully take a television set from another. Essentially, what this scenario is saying is that correcting injustice is never immoral. And in a world of moral absolutism, any act that attempts to correct injustice will be considered unjust. So, affirmative action, while it may discriminate, because it is amending a past wrong, it should not be considered discrimination. It should not be considered immoral. So, we just covered a few knowledge issues, a few assumptions, from definitions to what exactly race is, to what discrimination is, and whether reverse discrimination should play a factor in answering the question. To conclude, I would like to offer my own opinion on the question of whether or not affirmative action is racial discrimination. The most important thing to remember is that compensation is taking place. It's readily agreed upon that certain minority groups were wronged by the majority group, and as a means of compensation, affirmative action policies has been put in place, and while it may not be perfect, it is a means to an end, and eventually it's important to remember that affirmative action is a temporary solution, and as society reaches a more equal level, as it becomes a meritocracy and there's equal opportunity for all, affirmative action policies will no longer be necessary. And I'd like to conclude with a quote from the President Lyndon B. Johnson, who said that, "You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, 'You are free to compete with all the others,' and still justly believe that you have been completely fair." Thank you for listening. The following are works cited.